The Veil of Isis by Rene Guenon. Chapter 1. Faucu and the HBL. Prior to participating in the inception of the movement that may properly be designated as occultist, Albert Faucu served as a founding member of the initial French branch of the Theosophical Society. Shortly thereafter, he established contact with the organization widely recognized by the initials H.B. of L., signifying the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, which proposed as its primary objective the establishment of external centers in the Occident intended to resurrect the rites of ancient initiations. This organization claimed an origin dating back 4,320 years prior to the year 1881 of the Christian era. Evidently, this is a symbolic date referring to specific cyclical periods. It professed a connection to a strictly Occidental tradition, for, according to its teachings, the Hermetic initiates had borrowed nothing from India. The similarities manifest among a number of different names, doctrines, and rites of the Hindus and Egyptians, far from demonstrating that Egypt had derived its doctrines from India, merely elucidated that the defining characteristics of their respective teachings originated from a singular stock, and this primordial source was neither Indian nor Egyptian, but rather the lost island of the Occident. Regarding the form recently adopted by the order, the following account was provided. In 1870, an adherent of the ancient order, which still endured within the original Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, acting with the permission of his fellow initiates, resolved to select a neophyte in Great Britain who could adequately transmit his views. Upon the completion of a significant private mission in continental Europe, he disembarked in Great Britain in 1873, where he succeeded in locating a neophyte whom he subsequently instructed, having sufficiently verified the authenticity of the latter's credentials. The neophyte then acquired permission to establish an outer circle of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, designed to attract those deemed worthy of the form of initiation for which they might qualify. Upon his affiliation with the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, Bartlett experienced certain reservations. Was this membership compatible with his standing in the Theosophical Society? He posed this inquiry to his master, an English clergyman, who hastened to reassure him by affirming that both he and his own master were likewise members of the Council of the Theosophical Society. Nevertheless, a thinly veiled hostility had persisted between the two organizations since 1878, when Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott were expelled from the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, an order with which they had been affiliated since 1875 through their acquaintance with the Egyptologist George Henry Felt. Undoubtedly, when the Theosophist Journal claimed in one of its issues that this outer circle of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor dated back only to 1884, its intent was to conceal the unflattering expulsion of the two founders of the Theosophical Society. Peculiarly, the very same journal had, in 1885, published an advertisement for the Occult Magazine of Glasgow, a publication of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, wherein it appealed to individuals desiring admission into an occult fraternity, which does not openly boast of its knowledge, but freely and unreservedly instructs all those whom it finds worthy of receiving its teachings, an indirect, yet strikingly clear, allusion to the opposing practices for which the Theosophical Society was widely known and criticized. The hostility of the Theosophical Society was to reach its culmination later, when members of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor initiated a project to establish a kind of agricultural colony in America. Madame Blavatsky found this a favorable opportunity to avenge her prior expulsion, successfully contriving to have the Secretary-General of the Order, Thomas Henry Burgoyne, barred from obtaining residency in the United States. Peter Davidson, who held the title of Northern Provincial Grand Master, was the sole individual permitted entry. He subsequently settled with his family in Loudsville, Georgia, where he passed away several years ago. In July 1887, Peter Davidson authored a letter to Bartlett wherein, after characterizing esoteric Buddhism as an endeavor to corrupt the Western spirit, he stated, "The genuine and sincere adepts do not teach these doctrines of karma and reincarnation, as promulgated by the authors who profess esoteric Buddhism and other theosophical works. Neither in the works discussed above, nor in the pages of the Theosophist, is there, to the best of my awareness, an accurate and esoteric understanding of these significant questions." One of the principal objectives of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor was to reveal the complete mysteries of these grave and profound subjects to those brethren who have demonstrated their worth. It must be noted that the Theosophical Society is not, and has never been ever since Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott arrived in India, under the direction or inspiration of an authentic and genuine Himalayan fraternity, but rather under that of an inferior order belonging to a Buddhist cult. I am speaking here of a matter that I know and hold to be true upon indisputable authority. However, should you harbor any doubts regarding my assertions, Mr. Alexander de Corfu possesses several letters from Madame Blavatsky in which she clearly confesses to much of what I have just conveyed to you. 1 year later, Peter Davidson inscribed, in another letter, this somewhat enigmatic phrase: "The true adepts and the true Mahatmas are akin to the two poles of a magnet. Although several Mahatmas exist within the ranks of our order, they reveal themselves as Mahatmas only for matters of the utmost importance." At this juncture, namely, in the middle of 1888, Bartlett was departing from the Theosophical Society, following dissensions that had arisen within the Parisian Isis branch and the reverberations surrounding the Lotus branch of that period. It was also around this time that Papus began to formally organize Martinism. Bartlett was among the first to be summoned to its Supreme Council. It was initially established that the purpose of Martinism was to serve as a point of preparation, enabling its members to enter an order that could confer true initiation upon those capable of receiving it. The order intended for this purpose was none other than the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, of which Bartlett had become the official representative in France. This is the reason why, in 1891, Papus wrote, "Genuine occult societies exist which still possess the integral tradition. As a witness, I name one of my masters in practice, one of the most scholarly Westerners, Peter Davidson." However, this project did not succeed, and it was ultimately recognized that the superior center of Martinism was the Kabbalistic order of the Rosicrucian, which had been founded by Stanislas de Guaita. Bartlett was also a member of the Supreme Council of this order, and upon Guaita's death in 1896, he was appointed to succeed him as Grand Master. Nevertheless, even if he formally held the title, he never exercised its functions in any effective manner. In fact, the order held no regular meetings following the demise of its founder. Later, when Papus considered reviving it, Bartlett, who was no longer affiliated with any occultist groups, declared his complete disinterest. He believed, undoubtedly with good reason, that such attempts, resting on no solid foundation, could only lead to renewed failures. We shall not speak further of certain more or less ephemeral organizations with which Bartlett affiliated himself, perhaps with undue facility. His profound sincerity and honest, trusting character prevented him, under these circumstances, from perceiving that some individuals merely sought to exploit his name as a guarantee of respectability. Ultimately, these unfortunate experiences had compelled him to exercise greater caution and to question the utility of all those associations which, beneath pretensions of initiation, merely concealed their profound ignorance. Such groups served as little more than pretexts for individuals to adorn themselves with pompous titles. Thus, He perceived the inherent vanity of those external forms from which genuinely initiatory organizations remain entirely free. Several months prior to his demise, he spoke of a new, so-called Rosicrucian society imported from America, which he had been invited to join. He informed us that he intended to decline the offer, as he remained absolutely convinced, much as we are, that genuine Rosicrucians never founded societies. We shall close upon this conclusion, which Bartlett reached at the culmination of extensive research, and which ought to furnish many of our contemporaries with serious cause for reflection, should they wish, as the teachings of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor articulated, to learn to know the enormous difference between the intact truth and the apparent truth that exists between the real initiation and its innumerable counterparts. Chapter 2. The Outer Circle. The Occult Review, in its May 1925 issue, published a note regarding the article we devoted to Albert Faucu and his involvement with a variety of initiatory societies. However, specifically concerning the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, a plethora of inaccurate information has surrounded discussions of this topic. Therefore, in order to rectify these misconceptions, we must clarify what has been previously stated. Firstly, when Bartlett became affiliated with the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, the headquarters of the organization had not yet been relocated to America. This affiliation must have occurred slightly prior to the publication of the Occult magazine, which appeared in Glasgow throughout 1885 and 1886, and of which we possess the complete collection. This journal was indeed an official publication of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, whose motto was Omnia Vincit Veritas. At that time, Peter Davidson resided in Banbury, Kincardineshire, New Brunswick, and it was not until the close of 1886 that he relocated to Loudsville, Georgia, where he would reside for the remainder of his life. It was much later that he published a new periodical entitled The Morning Star, serving as the official organ of the Order of the Cross and the Serpent, which he founded following the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor's return to a state of dormancy. Conversely, it was in the October 1885 issue of the Occult magazine that a notice was initially published, publicizing for the first time the proposition to organize an agricultural colony of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor in California. This notice was signed with the initials of Thomas Henry Burgoyne, the Secretary General of the Order. This project was frequently mentioned in related discussions. Nevertheless, the prospect of establishing the colony in California was soon abandoned in favor of Georgia. It was even announced that Burgoyne would arrive in Loudsville by April 15, 1886, yet he never appeared, an absence attributed to the aforementioned intervention of Madame Blavatsky. Burgoyne had previously been convicted of fraud. Madame Blavatsky, apprised of this fact, successfully obtained documents containing proof of the conviction, which she subsequently forwarded to the American government in order to prevent Burgoyne from remaining within the United States. Her underlying motive for this action was to exact vengeance for her and General Olcott's exclusion from the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor 8 years prior, in 1878. As for Davidson, whose integrity was never called into question, he was not compelled to flee to America, as the Occult Review had purported. Rather, there was nothing to preclude him from settling in Georgia with his family to establish the foundational nucleus of the future colony. Nonetheless, this endeavor never achieved its long-anticipated fruition. The editor of the Occult Review states that Davidson acted on behalf of Burgoyne. This is entirely incorrect, as their respective positions did not entail any subordination of the former to the latter. Furthermore, and even more astonishingly, the editor subsequently asserts that behind even Burgoyne stood a former Brahmin named Harichand Christaman. This is a peculiar error, and one that necessitates some elucidation. Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott had affiliated themselves with the American branch of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor around April 1875, by way of George Henry Felt, who claimed to be a professor of mathematics and Egyptology, and with whom they had been acquainted through a journalist named Stevens. One consequent result of this affiliation was that, during the spiritualist seances hosted by Madame Blavatsky, the manifestations of the renowned John King were superseded by those of a certain Serapis on September 7, 1875, and it was on November 17 of that very same year that the Theosophical Society was founded. Approximately 2 years later, Serapis was, in turn, replaced by a certain Kashmiri brother. It was at this juncture that Olcott and Madame Blavatsky encountered Harichand Chintaman, who was not the clandestine head of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, but rather the American representative of the Arya Samaj, an association founded in India in 1870 by Swami Dayananda Sarasvati. In September or October of 1877, to use the words of Madame Blavatsky, an offensive and defensive alliance was forged between the Arya Samaj and the Theosophical Society. This alliance was ultimately severed in 1882 by Dayananda Sarasvati himself, who subsequently spoke with severe criticism regarding Madame Blavatsky's conduct. The latter, for reasons that remain unknown, later exhibited a profound terror of Harichand Chintaman. What is essential to recall, however, is that these relations commenced at the precise moment when he began to refute the assertions put forth by the Occult Review. Presently, an explanation for this error has yet to be ascertained. Might there not have simply been some confusion, arising from the partial similarity of the two surnames, Chintaman and Medamon? This latter name belonged to the master of Madame Blavatsky, the magician Paulus Medamon, an individual of Coptic or Chaldean extraction, whom she had met in Asia Minor in 1848 and later tracked down in Cairo in 1870. One might ask, however, what relationship existed between this individual and the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor. To address this inquiry, we must inform our associate at the Occult Review, who appears oblivious to the fact of the identity of the true leader, or, to speak more precisely, the Grand Master of the outer circle of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor. This Grand Master was Dr. Max Theon, who would later create and direct the cosmic movement. This fact elucidates why Barlet, the former representative of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor in France, aligned himself with this initiative from its inception. Regarding the origins of Dr. Max Theon, which have always remained shrouded in mystery, we possess but a single testimony. Nevertheless, it is one that warrants serious consideration. Barlet himself, renowned for his honesty and consistency, assured us that Theon was the biological son of Paulus Medamon. If this is indeed accurate, everything is elucidated by this single fact. In our preceding article, we had not wished to implicate any living individuals, which is why we refrained from explicitly naming Mr. Theon, confining ourselves merely to an allusion. However, following the intervention of the Occult Review, a precise clarification became imperative in the interest of historical truth. It is entirely expected that these explanations will elicit further questions, for we do not pretend to dispel all obscurities at once. There must be other witnesses to the facts in question, and since certain inquiries have been raised, could they not step forward to share what they know? Chapter 3. Sedur's Christian Turn. We learned with profound sorrow of the premature passing of Paul Sedur, just as we were reading his article in the previous issue of Spiritual Friendships, the essay he had devoted to Hindu metaphysics, which dealt specifically with our book, Man and His Becoming According to the Vedanta. Sedur, in fact, had previously been fascinated by the Indian doctrines. It was primarily, we believe, the influence of Dr. Alphonse Jobert that had steered him in this direction. He subsequently published a study on the incantations, which, as an essay, remained somewhat vague, yet nonetheless offered the promise of more exhaustive future works. Later, however, he merely provided certain notes utilized in lectures concerning the Hindu tradition, which, if our memory does not fail us, appeared in Mr. Jolivet Costello's journal. For the record, we also wish to mention a booklet on fakirism, a rudimentary summary of the existing knowledge on the subject, which is, incidentally, of secondary importance. Sedur was not long in altering his academic orientation, turning toward a rather peculiar Christian mysticism that was far more concerned with action than with mere knowledge. A great number of his friends, while continually acknowledging his profound sincerity, could not help but regret this shift, which deeply disappointed them. It must be admitted as true, for it may help to clarify certain matters, that Sedur had found little encouragement from the few Hindus he had encountered, whom he deemed overly preoccupied with phenomena. Had it not been for this, perhaps, he would have persevered in shedding this Western inclination to delve more profoundly into the knowledge of the veritable doctrines. Unfortunately, he entrenched himself in a hostile attitude that invariably caused us a measure of astonishment. He sought, between Christianity and the Oriental traditions, oppositions that simply did not exist. He perceived a sort of irreconcilable divergence where we observed a profound harmony and a genuine unity beneath the diversity of external forms. His final article still bears the hallmark of this perspective. On the other hand, we believe there is evidence that he never ceased to harbor an interest in the Indian doctrines, in his innermost depths and despite appearances, which had exerted such a powerful attraction upon him at the dawn of his career. Had he lived longer, who knows whether he might not have returned with a different disposition, and whether he might not have perceived the new horizons that had opened before him. This consideration can only amplify the regret felt by those who knew him, following his sudden and unexpected passing. Chapter 4. Champernad's Oriental Studies. Léon Champernad passed away on October 23, 1925, at the age of merely 55, following a protracted and agonizing illness. He had been involved in the contemporary occultist movement from a remarkably young age, almost from its very inception, and he assumed a highly active role, despite producing little written work. Having become a member of the Supreme Council of the Martinist Order under the name Noel Cicera, he served as the editor-in-chief of a rather obscure publication. The Initiator, an initiatory study bulletin reserved for Martinist representatives, published a mere 7 issues between January 1904 and March 1905. From the 4th issue onward, Cicera's name as editor-in-chief was supplanted by that of Sedur. It was around this time that Léon Champernad began to distance himself from Western occultism, which had appeared to him to be at a standstill, and turned definitively toward the study of the Oriental doctrines, a subject in which he had already harbored an interest for some time. It was then that he, alongside Maggioi, founded the review The Way, which was published from April 1904 to March 1907. Under the pseudonym Theophane, he published the first part of the Secret Teachings of Gnosis with Simon. This volume was intended to be followed by 2 additional installments, but they were never brought to print. It was again under the moniker of Theophane that he presented, in 1910, a study on Maggioi, his role within the Chinese secret societies, and a synthesis of Taoist metaphysics. Finally, between 1909 and 1912, he also oversaw the journal The Nose, which he helped to steer toward the study of the Oriental traditions. Having known him during this period, and having collaborated with him continuously over many years, We cannot permit him to pass into obscurity without offering a poignant remembrance, nor without recalling that he was among the first in France to labor toward making the true metaphysical doctrines of the East known. Chapter 5. The Vital Knot. The question that was posed and considered in the previous October issue of The Veil of Isis must, as we understand it, be divided in two. A question of a historical order and a question of a symbolic order. The divergence of opinion resides, in fact, solely within the first of these two perspectives. Moreover, this contradiction is perhaps only apparent and not essential. If the Strasbourg Cathedral is indeed the official center of a certain rite of companionage, could it not be that the Cathedral of Cologne serves as a center for the same rite? And would it not stand to reason, precisely on these grounds, that two separate Masonic charters, one originating in Strasbourg and the other in Cologne, might have given rise to confusion? This matter would require further investigation, and it would concurrently become necessary to ascertain whether the charters bear identical or differing dates. This point is particularly intriguing from a historical perspective. While this is not of paramount importance to us, it is nonetheless not devoid of value, as it is connected in a certain manner to the symbolic point of view. It is not for arbitrary reasons that these locations were selected as centers by the organizations in question. In any event, we find ourselves in complete agreement with Mr. Albert Burnet when he asserts that the sensitive point must exist within all cathedrals erected according to the true rules of the art, and when he states that, above all, it must be analyzed from a symbolic standpoint. There is, in this regard, a curious connection to be made. Wronski affirmed that within every body, there exists a specific point which, if removed, causes the entire body to break apart and volatilize in such a manner that all its molecules are dissipated. Furthermore, he claimed to have discovered the means of determining the location of such a center of cohesion. Is this not, especially when contemplating the symbolic aspect as we believe one must, fundamentally the same as this sensitive point of the cathedrals? The question, in its most general sense, pertains to what may be termed the vital knot. The defining aspect of this issue is encapsulated by the same expression as the famous Gordian knot of antiquity. Despite this, modern Masons would doubtless be astounded to learn that their sword can function ritually in the exact same capacity as that of Alexander. Alternatively, we might reiterate once more that the effective resolution of the issue in question is intimately related to the power of the keys, as extended in its hermetic significance, or to what corresponds to the second phase of the coagula, the solve of the alchemists. It must not be forgotten that, as highlighted in the article in Regnabit to which Mr. Paul Redinel referred, Janus, being the god of initiation into the mysteries for the Romans, was simultaneously the patron of the guilds of craftsmen and artisans that persisted through the Middle Ages, and which have even endured into modern times via the rite of companionage. Few, no doubt, retain any genuine understanding today of the profound symbolism of the Lodge of St. John. Chapter 6. Esclarman's Passing. On the 9th of last February, following a protracted and painful illness endured with immense courage, Marie Chauvel de Chauvigny passed away in Toulon, where she had retired in recent years. All who knew her, and who appreciated the profound qualities of her heart and intellect, will be deeply moved to learn of her passing. Under the pseudonym Esclarman, she had collaborated on the journal The Nose, publishing several original works, including a brief exposition of Gnostic doctrine. However, the vast majority of her writings remain unpublished. We wish to express our gratitude on behalf of all her friends, to the members of the psychic group in Toulon who assisted her in her final moments, and to those who were gracious enough to attend to her pious burial. Chapter 7. Universality of truth. Among the endowments of the genuine Rosicrucians, or, to speak more precisely, among their characteristic attributes, we frequently mention the gift of languages, though what is precisely meant by this has never been clearly explained. Admittedly, the literal interpretation of such a phrase can be justified in certain respects. Indeed, the possession of specific linguistic keys can provide, in order to comprehend and speak a diverse array of languages, means that are quite distinct from those ordinarily understood, and it is indubitable that there exists what might be termed a sacred philology, which is fundamentally different from profane philology. Nevertheless, while accepting this initial interpretation, it is permissible to concede, above all, a symbolic significance of a higher order, which is superimposed upon the former without contradicting it in any way, and which aligns with the initiatory principles common to all traditions, whether Oriental or Occidental. Proceeding from this perspective, it may be stated that the individual who truly possesses the gift of languages is one who addresses each person in his own tongue, in the sense that he consistently expresses himself in a form suited to the varying modes of men's different languages. It is always the identical thought, which in and of itself is independent of all expression, and every time it is articulated in another language, it becomes accessible to men who, without it, could never have apprehended it, and this analogy is, moreover, strictly in accordance with the symbolism of the gift of languages. He who has attained this state is one who has reached, through direct and profound cognition, the singular source of all traditional doctrines, having discovered the truth concealed beneath the multiplicity and diversity of external forms. The difference, indeed, resides solely in form and appearance, as the essential substance remains everywhere and always the same, because there exists but a singular truth, and, as the Muslim initiates continue to declare, the doctrine of unity is unique, but it assumes a variety of forms to adapt to the mental conditions of this region or that region, of this epoch or that epoch, and those who remain constrained by form perceive primarily the differences, while these discrepancies dissipate. For those who transcend them, those who transcend may subsequently descend into form, but without being affected by it in any way, and without their profound understanding being modified in any manner, they can deduce the logical consequences of a principle, and realize, proceeding from above to below, from the inside out, all the adaptations of the fundamental doctrine. In this manner, to employ the same symbolism, they are no longer compelled to speak one particular language, for they are capable of speaking all of them because they have realized the very principle from which all languages derive and adapt. What we have herein designated as languages are all the traditional forms, religious and otherwise, which are, in reality, merely adaptations of the great primordial, universal tradition, being different vestments of the one truth. Those who have transcended all particular forms and attained universality, thus knowing what others merely believe, are necessarily orthodox in the light of any formal tradition, and, concurrently, they are the sole individuals who may call themselves fully and effectively Catholic, in the strictly etymological sense of the term, whereas others can only be so virtually, through an aspiration that has not yet realized its object. Those who have passed beyond form are thereby emancipated from the limitations inherent in the individual condition of ordinary humanity, and that is why they can, as previously stated, assume varying individualities to suit all circumstances, since these individualities, for them, truly hold no more significance than mere garments. They are, according to Hindu tradition, superior when compared to name and form, which constitute the elements of individuality, as the name is the expression of the individual essence itself, and one can comprehend this through what a change of name or title truly signifies from an initiatory perspective. The same external formality is universally found to symbolize a change of state, and even within monastic orders, its fundamental purpose is in no way different from that at the secular level, for here too the former individuality must disappear to yield to a new being, and even when the symbolism does not visibly exist, it is still more fully understood in its deepest sense, despite retaining a certain efficacy. Should one comprehend these indications, one will simultaneously understand why the true Rosicrucians could never constitute a society in the modern and profane sense of the term. Those who reside beyond all form cannot confine themselves within the strictures of an organization possessing written statutes and regulations, fixed meeting places, and external signs of recognition, none of which they require. They can, undoubtedly, as may still be observed in the Orient, inspire visibly, and in a certain respect invisibly, external organizations temporarily established for a particular and definite purpose, but they do not bind themselves to these entities, nor do they, save in highly exceptional cases, play any apparent role within them. That which has been designated as Rosicrucian in the West since the 14th century, and which has received disparate designations in other eras and locales, is by no means an association whatsoever, but rather it is the collectivity of beings who have attained the same superior state that, when contrasted with inferior humanity, renders apparent the degree of initiation, of which we have endeavored to outline one of the essential aspects, and who thus possess the identical internal character which suffices entirely as a sign of recognition. This is why they possess no meeting place other than the temple of the Holy Ghost, which is omnipresent, and this is also why they remain unknown to the layman among whom they reside, precisely because their sole distinctive marks are purely interior and can be perceived only by those who have attained the corresponding spiritual development and marks, ensuring that their influence is exercised through means incomprehensible to the common man. Chapter 8. Bohemians and Guilds. In an article authored by Mr. Gustav Milcent, initially published in the journal The Companionship in May 1926, and published again in the November 1927 issue of The Veil of Isis, we noted the sentence. What surprised me, and indeed elicited a degree of skepticism, was Charles Burnet stating that he presides at Saints Mary's de la Mer, over the annual election of the King of the Bohemians. We have maintained this same perspective for a considerable time but preferred not to raise the question initially, but now that it has been posed publicly, we have no reason to withhold comment and thus offer a few remarks, especially since this may help to elucidate certain points that are not devoid of interest. In the first place, it is not a king whom the Bohemians elect, but rather it is a queen, and furthermore this election is not an annual occurrence, for what transpires annually is, with or without the election, the assembly of the Bohemians in the crypt of the church at Saints Mary's de la Mer. Furthermore, it is entirely plausible that certain individuals who do not belong to the Bohemian race are admitted, by virtue of their qualities or competencies, to attend this gathering and the rites performed therein, but as to presiding over the assembly, it is quite another matter entirely, and the least we may conclude is that such a prospect remains highly improbable. Regarding the assertion in question, which was initially introduced long ago in an interview published in the Intransigent, we prefer to assume that any inaccuracies it contains should simply be attributed to the journalist. As is so often the case, the interviewer likely exaggerated the matter to stimulate the curiosity of an audience as ignorant as he himself was of the subjects being broached, thereby rendering him incapable of recognizing his own errors. Therefore, we do not wish to insist upon these claims beyond what is appropriate. The true interest of this case lies not in such details, but rather in the broader relations that may exist between the Bohemians and the Compagnonic organizations. Mr. Milcent, in his article, proceeds to assert that the Bohemians practice the Jewish rite and that there may be connections to the foreign stonecutters of the duty of liberty companionage. The first part of this statement appears to contain an inaccuracy, or at the very least an equivocation. It is true that the Queen of the Bohemians bears the name, or rather, the title of Sarah, which is also the given name of the saint whom they recognize as their patroness and whose remains reside in the crypt of the Saints Marys. Furthermore, it is true that this title, the feminine form of Sar, is Hebrew and translates to princess. Yet, is this sufficient grounds to speak of a Jewish rite? Judaism pertains to a people for whom religion is inextricably bound to race. However, the Bohemians, whatever their true origin may be, certainly share nothing in common with the Jewish race. Nevertheless, despite this divergence, might there not also exist reports of certain affinities of a more mysterious order? When discussing Bohemians, it is indispensable to draw a distinction that is all too frequently neglected. There are, in fact, two distinct kinds of Bohemians who appear entirely foreign to one another and treat each other as enemies. They do not possess the same ethnic characteristics, they do not speak the same language, and they do not engage in the same professions. First, there are the Eastern Bohemians or Zingarees who are predominantly showmen and boilermakers. Second, there are the Southern Bohemians or Gitans who are known as Caracs in Languedoc and Provence. These individuals are almost exclusively horse traders, and it is this latter group alone that convenes at the Saints Marys. In a highly curious study titled The Bohemians of the Saints Marys de la Mer, the Marquis of Baroncelli-Givan delineates numerous traits shared by the Bohemians and Native Americans. Based on these parallels, as well as their own interpretations of their traditions, he does not hesitate to attribute an Atlantean origin to them. Although this remains merely a hypothesis, it is nonetheless worthy of mention. Yet, here lies something uniquely extraordinary that has not been observed elsewhere. Just as there are two kinds of Bohemians, there are similarly two kinds of Jews, the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim. One may draw analogous comparisons regarding their differences in physical features, language, and aptitudes. Moreover, these two groups do not always maintain the most amicable relations, as each readily claims to represent the purest form of Judaism, whether in respect to race or to tradition. There is even a striking similarity with regard to language. Truthfully, neither the Jews nor the Bohemians possess a complete language that is entirely their own, at least not for everyday use. Instead, they adopt the languages of the regions in which they reside, interspersing them with certain words of particular significance, Hebrew for the Jews and, for the Bohemians, terms derived from an ancestral tongue of which these scattered words represent the final remnants. This peculiarity can be explained by the fact that both groups have been compelled to live dispersed among strangers. What proves far more difficult to explain is the revelation that the regions traversed by both the Eastern and Southern Bohemians correspond precisely to those inhabited by the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim, respectively. Would it perhaps be overly simplistic to dismiss this as merely a pure coincidence? These observations lead us to surmise that, even if there are no ethnic relations between the Bohemians and the Jews, there may yet exist other affiliations that we might qualify as traditional. This brings us back to the primary subject of the article, from which we have deviated only in appearance, the Compagnonic organizations. Given that the question of ethnicity does not apply to them, could they not also possess relationships of a similar order, whether with the Jews, with the Bohemians, or among themselves? For the present, at least, we do not intend to elucidate the origins and the reasons behind these relationships. Rather, we shall content ourselves with drawing attention to a few specific details. Is the companionage not divided into several rival rites? And have they not frequently found themselves embroiled in more or less open hostility? Do they not observe distinct programs in accordance with their differing rites, maintaining different points of attachment? Do they not, in a certain sense, possess a special language, the substance of which is formed by ordinary speech, yet is distinguished by the introduction of specific terms, much like the linguistic practices of the Jews and the Bohemians? Do we not employ the term jargon to designate the ordinary language utilized within certain secret societies, particularly in regard to the companionships, and do the Jews not sometimes assign the very same name to the language they speak? Furthermore, in certain countries are the Bohemians not known as passers, a term that often causes them to be confused with peddlers, which, as we know, is also a designation applied to some companions? Finally, could the legend of the wandering Jew, much like many other tales, potentially be of Compagnonic origin? We could undoubtedly multiply the number of such questions. However, we believe this suffices, and that further research guided in this direction could illuminate certain enigmas. Perhaps we shall return to this matter if necessary, providing a few additional characteristics. Yet one must ask, are the companions of today truly so interested in all that relates to their traditions? Chapter 9. Dante's Symbolic Lady. Under the title The Secret Language of Dante and the Faithful Ones of Love, Luigi Valli, to whom we are already indebted for several illuminating studies on the significance of Dante's writings, has published a new work of such profound importance that we cannot pass over it with a mere bibliographical note. Its thesis may be briefly summarized as follows. The various ladies celebrated by the poets affiliated with the mysterious organization of the Faithful Ones of Love, from Dante, Guido Cavalcanti, and their contemporaries to Boccaccio and Petrarch, are not women who actually walked this earth. Rather, they are all, under different names, one and the same symbolic lady, representing transcendent intelligence or divine wisdom. In support of this thesis, the author brings forward formidable documentation and a compelling array of arguments that must impress even the most skeptical. In particular, he demonstrates that those verses appearing most unintelligible from a literal standpoint become perfectly clear when approached with the hypothesis of a jargon or unconventional language, the principal terms of which he claims to have deciphered. Moreover, he draws parallels to other traditions, notably that of the Persian Sufis, where similar profound meanings have been concealed in this manner beneath the guise of simple love poetry. It would not be feasible to summarize his entire argument, which is meticulously grounded in precise textual citations supporting his perspective. Thus, we can only direct anyone interested in the subject to the book itself. In truth, the core of this matter has always appeared to us as an obvious and incontestable fact, though it is one that nevertheless required firm establishment. Indeed, Valli foresees that his conclusions will face challenges from several kinds of adversaries. Firstly, the so-called positivist criticism. Secondly, the partisan spirit, whether Catholic or anti-Catholic, which will find absolutely no satisfaction in what he writes. And finally, aesthetic criticism and romantic rhetoric, which are fundamentally nothing other than what one might designate the literary spirit. Herein lies a collection of prejudices that will always and inevitably stand in opposition to the quest for the profound significance of certain works, although, in the presence of such works, those possessing good faith and an open mind will readily discern where the truth resides. For our part, the only objections we must raise pertain to certain interpretations that in no way affect the general thesis. Moreover, the author has made no claim to provide a definitive resolution to all the questions he introduces, and he is the first to concede that his work will require correction or amendment in many points of detail. Valli's principal shortcoming, from which derive most of the insufficiencies observed in his work, is, to state the matter plainly, that he lacks the initiatic mentality required to treat such a subject in depth. His perspective is far too exclusively that of a historian. It is insufficient to investigate history merely to resolve certain problems. Moreover, one is entitled to wonder whether this approach does not genuinely amount to interpreting medieval ideas through a modern mentality, a reproach the author quite rightly directs at the official critics. Did the men of the Middle Ages ever investigate history for its own sake? The aforementioned matter demands a more profound degree of understanding, and should one bring to it solely a profane spirit and intention, one can merely accumulate materials reflecting an entirely divergent spirit. Indeed, we fail to see any substantial interest in historical research should no doctrinal truth result from it. It is truly regrettable that the author lacks certain traditional data, alongside a direct and, so to speak, technical knowledge of his subject matter. This deficiency prevented him from recognizing the properly initiatic import of our study, the esoterism of Dante, and elucidates why he failed to comprehend how little it matters, from our perspective, whether such discoveries are attributed to Rossetti, Aru, or anyone else. Indeed, we cite them solely as supports for considerations of an entirely different order. We are concerned with initiatic doctrine, not literary history. Regarding Rossetti, we find the assertion that he was a Rosicrucian to be rather peculiar, as the genuine brothers of the Rose-Cross had vanished from the Western world long before his era. Furthermore, even if he had been affiliated with some sort of pseudo-Rosicrucian organization, of which there were so many, such an entity would certainly have possessed no authentic tradition to impart to him. Moreover, Rossetti's initial inclination to read a purely political meaning into every matter quite clearly contradicts such a hypothesis. Valli possesses only a highly superficial and altogether simplistic conception of Rosicrucianism, and he appears to have no inkling of the symbolism of the cross, just as he seems to have failed to grasp the traditional significance of the heart, which pertains to the intellect rather than to sentiment. Let us remark upon this latter point that the gentle heart of the faithful ones of love is the purified heart, that is to say, bereft of all that concerns worldly objects, and, by this very fact, rendered prepared to receive interior illumination. It is remarkable that an identical doctrine is found in Taoism. Let us proceed to certain other points raised during the course of our reading, for there exist several rather unfortunate references that detract from this otherwise serious work. Thus, one might easily have found superior authorities to cite on Gnosticism than George Robert Stowe Mead, on number symbolism than Mark Saunier, and, above all, on Masonry than Leo Taxil. Furthermore, Valli cites the last mentioned on a most elementary point, the symbolic ages of the various grades, a detail that can be found anywhere. In the same passage, following Rossetti, the author also cites the precious collection of Adonhiramic Freemasonry, yet the reference is presented in an altogether unintelligible fashion, which clearly demonstrates that he himself possesses no personal knowledge of the book in question. We harbor, moreover, grave reservations concerning everything Valli asserts regarding Masonry, which he bizarrely qualifies as ultramodern. An organization may indeed have lost its spirit through the intrusion of politics or other factors, yet still retain its symbolism intact even without comprehending it. However, Valli himself appears neither to possess a firm grasp of the true role of symbolism nor a very clear sense of traditional filiation. When discussing the various currents, he confounds esoterism with exoterism, taking as sources of inspiration for the faithful ones of love that which merely represents prior incursions into the profane world of an initiatic tradition from which these faithful ones of love themselves directly proceeded. Influences descend from the initiatic sphere into the profane world, but the inverse is impossible, for a river never returns to its source. That source is the foundation of the teaching so often in evidence in the poems studied here, and it is generally described as being situated at the foot of a tree that is obviously none other than the tree of life. The symbolism of the terrestrial paradise and of the celestial Jerusalem must find its application here. There are also some no less regrettable linguistic inaccuracies. Thus, the author categorizes as human matters that are, on the contrary, superhuman, as is the case, moreover, for anything of a truly traditional and initiatic order. Similarly, he commits the error of designating initiates of any grade whatsoever as adepts, whereas that term must be strictly reserved for the supreme degree. The misuse of this word is particularly noteworthy because it constitutes, so to speak, a hallmark. There exists a certain number of errors that the profane rarely fail to commit, and this is undoubtedly one of them. We must also call attention to the incessant use of words such as sect and sectarian to designate organizations that are initiatic rather than religious, an entirely improper and most displeasing usage, which brings us directly to the gravest shortcoming we are obliged to point out in Valli's work. This failing is Valli's continual conflation of the initiatic and the mystical points of view, and his assimilation of the matters in question into a religious doctrine, whereas esotericism, even when grounded upon religious forms, truly belongs to an entirely different order. A truly initiatic tradition cannot be heterodox. To classify it as such is to invert the normal and hierarchical relationship between the interior and the exterior. Esotericism is not contrary to orthodoxy, even orthodoxy construed simply in the religious sense. It is above or beyond the religious point of view, which is obviously not at all the same thing. In fact, the unjustified accusation of heresy was frequently nothing more than a convenient ruse for eliminating individuals who might prove problematic for entirely different reasons. Rossetti and Aru were not mistaken in their belief that, in Dante's works, theological expressions must be interpreted inversely. Esotericism is not superimposed upon exoterism, yet neither is it opposed to it, for it does not exist upon the same plane. Rather, it imparts a deeper meaning to the same truths by transposing them to a higher order. It is of course true that Amor is the inverse of Roma, but we must not conclude from this, as some have wished to do, that it signifies the antithesis of Roma. Rather, Roma is merely its reflection or visible image, necessarily inverted, as is the image of an object in the mirror, which affords us the occasion to recall the through a mirror in an enigma of St. Paul. With regard to Rossetti and Aru, and despite certain reservations we hold concerning their interpretations, we must append that one cannot dismiss a method as unacceptable merely because it is unverifiable, without incurring the risk of succumbing to the prejudices of positivist criticism, which would entail the rejection of all that is obtained by direct knowledge, especially and in particular all knowledge acquired through the regular transmission of a traditional teaching, which is indeed unverifiable for the profane. It is all the more astonishing that Valli conflates esotericism with heterodoxy, given that he has at least comprehended, far better than his predecessors, that the doctrine of the faithful ones of love was by no means anti-Catholic and that it shared nothing in common with the profane currents from which the Reformation was ultimately to emerge. Whence, then, did he derive the notion that the Church had disclosed the more profound significance of its mysteries to the general populace? On the contrary, so diminutive a portion of this is taught by the Church that one is compelled to doubt, with good reason, whether she herself has retained any knowledge thereof. And it is precisely in this deprivation of spirit that the corruption previously denounced by Dante and his associates consisted, although the most elementary prudence dictated that when speaking of this corruption they refrain from doing so with Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.